my computer kind of crashed and I'm just resetting. So it will be momentarily. I'm just opening up my presentation. But it's a pleasure. I haven't had the pleasure of teaching in India yet. And this is my first time, but it's virtual. So hopefully in the future it will be in person. Okay, so let me share my screen and we'll get started. So just to confirm, I have about an hour and a half. Is that right? And this is near the end of your week, correct? Of this course. Okay, let me just share my screen. Share. Here we are. There we go. Can you see my screen? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Can you
Yes,
guys
sir.
hear me okay? Someone give me a thumbs up that they can see my screen and
We can
yeah,
see,
it's all
sir.
good? Okay, perfect. I just want to make sure I can see you guys. Yeah, beautiful. Okay, that's awesome. Okay, I'm just getting my screen set up and we'll get started. Alrighty. There we go. I had everything set up, of course, and then it all just, was just terrible. Okay, so let me get started. So today, first and foremost, thank you for the introduction. Yes, I'm at the University. I have the pleasure of teaching at the University of Toronto. I do research in the area of artificial intelligence and machine learning in medical images. I suspect you guys know a lot about that now after this week on that very topic. And so I will just maybe go over a little bit. I won't want to do too much more than what you've already seen, but I'll probably talk about it a little bit more. So I'm appointed to 3 departments. My primary department is the Department of Medical Imaging in the Faculty of Medicine. I'm also appointed to what's called the Institute of Medical Science, as well as the Department of Statistical Sciences as well. So those are the 3 departments I'm in. As you can see, these are the programs on this slide that I've developed. No surprise, they all start with MI, which stands for medical imaging. All right. Let's just move forward, which it's not doing. Here we go. So I do have some disclosures. I'm sure you do the same in India. And that is that the possibility of conflict of interest. No surprise. I have my own company, and it's in the area of artificial intelligence and machine learning. I'm also a consultant and PI for the company, the pharmaceutical company Novo Nordisk. And I'm also on advisory boards for a couple of other companies. And I do a lot in Costa Rica, actually. A lot of my research and a lot of my time is spent in Costa Rica, which is not a bad thing. Very nice there. I don't know if anyone has been to Costa Rica, but it's a lovely country, kind of in Central America. Okay, so today's talk is about the old solutions are the new problem, minimizing bias in medical AI. So today I'm going to talk to you about the possibility or the problems of bias in artificial intelligence in medical imaging, as well as ethics, so the ethical use of data in research. So this, as I said, this is just going to be a quick little overview, which is, what is AI used for today? And I'm sure you all know that the reason that we're focusing so much on artificial intelligence today, it's not because it's new. It's not a new technology, if you wish, but it's just that we can do it now, right? So we're ingesting large amounts of data to train models and using it to analyze for correlations and patterns and associations within the data that can help us predict something in the future. Now, there's always that controversy that can AI perform better than humans? So yes, it can sometimes, but generally it's when it's a repetitive or a detail-oriented task. That is when AI is at its strength. I really don't think it's a big risk of replacing humans anytime soon. It's just going to change the way we do things. So this is just a figure that talks about data science, which is the field that you are in. And data science is made up of 3 pillars. And the 3 pillars are, of course, the first one you think of is computer science, no surprise. The other one is math. And the third one is what's called domain expertise. So I assume everyone in your university would come under computer science, maybe math. But the third one, domain expertise, which one does that represent? It represents the people who know about the data, who understand the data, who work with the data. And that pillar is often overlooked. So meaning that in research, you'll have engineers and statisticians and mathematicians that will come together, and they will do a lot of work, and they'll gain access to a data set, and they will work with that data set for years and years and years and reuse it and reuse it and reuse it. And that's fantastic. However, they've forgotten that you do need to talk to, involve, work with the people who actually own the data, use the data, produce the data. And that's the domain expertise. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, because unfortunately, if you don't work with the people who know about the data, you run the risk of creating an algorithm, which is called a biased algorithm. And I'll talk to you guys about that today. So big data was a, sorry, I'm just changing my lighting here to make it a little easier for me. So big data was a term, is a term that is still used, but it was a very popular term maybe 5-8 years ago. And it was because we were in a position, because of cheap storage, data, like in terms of computer storage, we had better increasing compute power. And most importantly, we are in the 4th industrial revolution, which is networking. And because of the networking, we are able to share and collect more and more data. So one of the easy ways to remember what the definition of big data is the 5 V's. I suspect you already know this, which is just volume, which is the amount of data, velocity, which is how much data arrives, or you collect, how much you collect in a given point in time. The variety of data, so the different forms of data that you have. Veracity, which is another word for authenticity, so meaning, is your data what it's supposed to be? Accurate is what you expect it to be. And then the last one, which is more of a business term, but is used across the board, is value. So meaning, does your data represent value? Does it represent something that you can use and benefit from? Okay, so we're going to jump right into, today we're talking about bias and ethics. So keep remembering we're talking about bias and ethics. So one of the tricky bits about data is, in my world, so in the world of medicine, is most of the data comes from people like you, right? It comes from individuals who are being treated at the various institutions, hospitals, clinics around the world. And that's the data that we use for research. And so, of course, as you can imagine, that is considered personal data, right? So that's what I use, which is healthcare. But, if your preference for a cell phone, your preference for your favorite snack, those which would come under marketing, those are still that's still personal data, right? That is your data. It's your preferences. It belongs to you. So this data, though, is very important in the sense that you use it in order to develop the models for what's called data-driven decision making, because everything is about making decisions, and you would like to predict that decision, right? So that's the significance of personal data. And one of the challenges, right, is when you use that data, right, you have to make sure that it's an ethical use of that data when you do research. So here's a quick little description of what ethics is. So ethics is the disciplined study or morality. And morality asks the question, what should one's behavior be, right? So it is important to remember the disciplined study or morality. So morality is what, as a society, do we consider correct, right, acceptable behavior? Okay, so it's a moral belief. And the reason I bring this, definition up is just to start to get you to think about how are you going to define what is right as a researcher? That's very important. And that's why I love the opportunity to talk to you, when I'm over here in Canada and you're over there in India, because the way we operate as a society differs. So meaning that how you do things and what you believe is right in India may not be the same as how I do things and what I believe is right in Canada. And so that's a very important consideration when you're doing research. So the history of ethics in research comes, it started well before the Declaration of Helsinki, but essentially the way we deal with ethics in research has started with the Declaration of Helsinki. And what happened was, after the Second World War, with all of the experimentation that went on with the Nazis, there were the Nuremberg trials, and these trials opened up essentially the beginning of the principles of ethical research in human beings. And what it meant was, or what they decided from the Nuremberg trials, is that you must have consent of research participants. So what that means is, as long as the research participant said, yes, sure, use my data, or, test a new drug on me, that was okay. But unfortunately, in 1961, things changed when there was a shocking test or a drug that was used, thalidomide, which resulted in the death of many children and many birth defects in these children, like many, 10,000, over 10,000 birth defects. And this was terrible, right? This was just a drug that was used and unfortunately resulted in a lot of mortality and morbidity. And so at that point, that's when, or 1964, a little bit afterwards, of course, they decided that there was a need for more than just having patients or people consent. There had to be some guidelines as to what is permissible to do for research. And the reason that this came up is because it involves people's health. You would imagine that for marketing, your choice of cell phone or smartphone, which one do you prefer? Do you prefer iPhone or do you prefer Android? The impact is not really as important as it is when it comes to the health of your children. And so that's where there was a bit of a disconnect. And then the Declaration of Helsinki is basically the start of where we are today in ethics. So I'm not going to belabor the point too much on ethics, but the only reason I'm bringing this just so that I can explain to you afterwards what a bias model is in AI. So ethical principles, you are all clearly knowledgeable in this area. It's just that you haven't put them all together probably when you think of your ethical principles. So the first one, the most important, is privacy, and everybody understands privacy because it's in your face all the time, right? Consent is you need to agree to share your information. So that's very important as well. And you also know about this. Transparency is more or less, right? So people are starting to understand that transparency is important. And transparency essentially is just that whatever you're doing, whatever kind of research you're doing, whatever kind of work you're doing, you need to share how that model you've built works, or how you did it, or how you came across it, or how you're doing your research. Fairness is another one that's important in the sense that when you do your research, is the way you're collecting data, the way you're applying your model, the way you're performing inference, is it fair? So fair means that it's equitable. It means that everybody is eligible to be part of it, to participate in, to benefit from it. And you'll see that that one is a big one for bias. Accountability and security is a little bit less obvious, but accountability just means that if you're going to do this work, if you're going to do this research, or if you're going to create these models, you need to be accountable. So that means that you need to take responsibility for what you're doing. Security, of course, is just safeguard what you're let's say the data, for instance, that you're using. Okay. So what are the challenges in data ethics? So inevitably, you've all heard of data breaches and security risks, right? So that one is obvious. It means that if I've, promised you that I'm going to safeguard your data so that I can use it for research, and then it gets leaked, or I share it with people, then that's a data breach, and I've basically lied to you. I'm using your data, but I've shared it, and when I promised I wouldn't. Informed consent is a tricky one, and that means, how did you get consent from the people that are sharing the data with you? So did you just ask them, or did you make sure that they understood your consent form? So for instance, let's say if I went to India and I wanted to collect a whole bunch of data to do research, but my form was only in English, right? Well, I'm sure, as you know, in India, there are many languages. And so the problem is, I need to make sure that whoever reads the consent form reads English. So there's an example of having correct informed consent. Data discrimination and bias is exactly what we're talking about today, and I'm going to go through that in depth, in the next slides. Lack of transparency means I'm not sharing with you how I'm doing things and the way that the process works. And profiling and surveillance is another form of discrimination, in a sense that profiling and surveillance means that you're looking specifically at a subset of your population. Okay, so actually, before I keep going, please feel free to ask questions in the chat or lift your hand or whatever at any time. I don't mind. This is a lecture. It doesn't have to be. Normally, I lecture in person, of course, and so I can see the audience clearly. And if someone doesn't look like they understand, I just stop and ask. So feel free to ask if so stop me, or if you can't hear me or whatever. Just put your hand up, or do it in the Teams. You're welcome to do that. Okay. What's the regulatory landscape? So regulatory means essentially law that governs the area or the discipline that you're working in. So in this case, regulatory means, okay, I just hear a little pop. Did I, I should check. Sorry, I'm just checking to make sure I can see my chat. There we go. I can see the chat now. Okay, perfect. So the regulatory landscape in this case, what we're referring to, of course, is privacy, right? So in your country, which is interesting, in India, I just found this out. I didn't even know, is that your DPDP Act only came into power in August of this year. So it's very recent that you have this Privacy Act in India that protects your private data, essentially, right? And of course, as you can imagine, there are acts all over the world. GDPR, which covers all of Europe. In Canada, it's called PIPEDA, which is for the Privacy Act for all of your data, but PHIPAA specifically for health information, HIPAA in the United States, PIPL in China, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not talking about regulatory today, but I just wanted to tell you that those are the acts, those are the legal acts that protect the data. All right, so let's get going on to something that's a little bit more in your area, in your field, and that is, how do we apply machine learning and artificial intelligence into clinical research, right? So the problems, we've already discussed these in the big data problem, which is data volume and complexity is something that you have to deal with. That's your challenge as an engineer is wow, I've got so much data and it's so complex. How do I get all of this into my model, right, for training? So that's a challenge. What algorithm do I choose? What approach do I choose? There are so many models that I can use. Which one should I use? Those are challenges, right? What's called continuous learning and adaptation means that things change. Data changes. It's not static, right? And the other problem is most of the time, very often, you use data that was collected 5 years ago, 10 years ago, right? So who's to say that that data represents what's going on today? That's one of the challenges, right? And then the last one is interpretability and transparency challenges, and we're going to talk about that today. And that is, you've created the best algorithm that you think. You've solved the problem. It works fantastic. It's 99% accurate. Whoa, that's amazing. The only thing is, the people who are going to use it generally is not you. Let's say you're creating a mammogram, an algorithm that looks for breast cancer for mammograms, right? So often, very often, the researchers, males, and very often, they are not physicians. That's the way it is currently in medical research, artificial intelligence, in the world. The most researchers that develop algorithms for medicine are non-physician males, so scientists who are male. So inevitably, there's a possibility that can introduce what's called bias into your algorithms, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more throughout this session. But I just wanted you to think about that, and I'm living proof. I am not a physician, and I'm male. And what do? I create algorithms for medicine, artificial intelligent algorithms for medicine. So there's an example of where, I'm part of this bias, right? And so that's just something for you to think about. Look around the room and just see how many people are male and female, and how many are from different ethnicities and different ages, and you'll just realize it. Now, I've got to say, when I saw the classroom, I was actually really pleasantly surprised to see a very good mix between males and females in your room, which is amazing. So that's fantastic. So that just on a side note, that's wonderful. Okay. So what we need to talk about is what's bias and fairness in AI algorithms, and what is a way of ethical AI development and deployment. So meaning, how can you work in a way that's ethical so that you can do your job, but that it's fair and unbiased. Okay. So we're not going to go over all these. I know these are what, but these are biases. So these are possible biases in, there's even more than this, but this is something that you need to take into consideration when you're collecting your data. Okay. So what kind of biases are we? So the ones that are probably most common is going to be selection bias, right? So meaning that you have a sampling bias. So you'll remember, I'm a statistician, by the way, and other things, but bias represents a form of error, correct? In error, you have essentially two types of error. You have random error, and you have bias, which is what's called systematic error, right? So you have those two together is basically your error term. So we're talking about the systematic error, which is bias. It means it shifts your mean in your distribution, right? Okay. So selection bias is very common, and that's where your sampling is not fair, essentially. And that's what we're talking about today. Convergence bias, participation bias, those are all different types of selection bias. Like a participation bias is, for instance, if you are if you're collecting data for your research and you put out a call, you say, hey, would you like to join my research? Come and join my research, come and give me the data and all this fun stuff. Well, you may get what's called participation bias because you're going to get people who want to participate to give you data. And those people who do not wish to participate won't give you data. So there's very possibly a bias in that data because those people who are not participating in your research won't give you data. So, and there might be something that's important in and associated with those people who are not participating. So very often that comes up in what's called socioeconomic status. And that means how are they in terms of their wealth, in terms of their means, right? Their ability to pay for their lifestyle, for their quality of life. So if people have very little money, if they're very poor, very often they will not participate in research because they're not even exposed to research. They don't even hear about it, right? And so that would be that's an example of a participation bias. The other types of biases, as I said, I'm not going to go into them, but there's reporting bias, which is a big one, which is the way that data is reported. Can definitely be a bias. So meaning that what's in the way you label your data, which is reporting bias, it is systematically shifted for whatever reason, due to language, due to the way it's actually entered, the way it's stored, the way there's many ways that it can come into play. And automation bias is in terms of how the data is collected. Anyway, I'm not going to go into all the details, but just to bring to your attention that there are many ways that data can end up being biased. Okay? All right. So this should look very familiar to all of you, right? So the first question, can I just ask the class here? Anybody can answer, or somebody can answer. Have you guys covered this kind of pipeline in your lectures this week, like in terms of a machine learning pipeline? Can someone just write in the chat yes, no? Like, is this kind of your world? What you guys are dealing with these days? Can I ask? Let me just see my chat. Can you guys type into the chat? Is that available for you guys, or can you say, speak out loud? I'm just trying to see how I can. Oh, perfect.
Yes, we have.
That's great. So is this pipeline something that you guys, this is your bread and butter? This is what you do every day? Is this kind of what you guys do? Does anybody do vision, computer vision? I'm sure you must have covered computer vision. I mean, there's, introduction to medical imaging, I'm sure was part of your content, right? So I'm just assuming this is right. Can someone give me a thumbs up or something?
Yes, sir, we got it.
Yeah? Okay, good. Awesome. So the reason I'm going to spend a fair amount, what I'm going to talk about mostly today is computer vision, because that's what I do. And that's what I'm sure you're learning to do. And so this is your classic, computer vision pipeline, right? And no surprise, you start with design, which is, what images am I going to use? Where am I going to get these images? What's interesting in the images? And then you spend a lot of time in data handling. So there's actually a piece here that's missing, because you see there's data splitting, feature extraction, all that stuff. But there's a piece that's missing in the data handling, and that is, how do I collect the data? Where do I get the data? How do I store the data? How do I curate the data? How do I make sure the labels are available? And if anyone here has done these projects, you'll realize that that's a lot of time. It's very time consuming to do that work, right? So just thought I'd point that out. So that's data handling. And then you have your modeling. So modeling, in my opinion, is the fun part. That's like, it's fun, right? Doing modeling is fun. And it's actually not that time consuming, interestingly. And, when you talk to engineers, they all say, oh my God, I only spend all my time modeling. Maybe, but that's probably because you're privileged. You're lucky in that you receive the data in an ingestible format, in something that you can use. But I'll tell you, in general, 70 to 80% of all time spent in a project is spent on collecting and pre-processing the data. The modeling is like 20% of your time. And I think it's the most fun, right? And in your modeling, you're going to choose, am I doing classification? Am I doing a regression? I have to validate, the model, and then the ones that people don't think about as well is it useful? Right? So utility. Is my model going to be useful? Can I use it? Is it going to be impactful? Is it of value? So that's clinical utility. And then, of course, you can compare it. You compare it to other ways of doing things. You compare it to, other models, right? And then the last step is reporting. So you have to share. If you don't report your work, if you don't report your research, why are you doing it? I mean, at school, it's different. When you're in university and you're learning, then that's wonderful. You're just learning how to do this computer vision. However, when you are a researcher, a scientist, you need to report your work. You need to share your work publicly. And the reason for that is generally scientists like me get paid by tax dollars, meaning you, the taxpayer in your country, are supporting research. And I get paid by that money. And so I have to report back to you because you're the one who paid for this research. And that's a very important concept. It's also called knowledge translation. And so knowledge translation is very important in making sure that research that is done is shared with everyone. Okay, anyway, that's a whole other talk, but I'll skip over to that one. Okay, so what are we going to talk about now? Let's there we go. So obviously I've just showed you the pipeline that you guys are all experts on. Great. What I want to show now is in these 4 study steps that I just covered, which is design, data handling, modeling, and reporting, there is the possibility of introducing bias into your model, and that's what we're going to talk about. So the first one we're going to talk about is design. So where or how can we introduce bias or problems, if you wish, challenges into your modeling? So we can do this, for instance, in your data size, like how much data do you have, right? That's always a challenge because if you have more or less data, as you know, you're going to be more or less successful in designing your model. Basically in designing your model. The other one is the robustness, what's called the robustness of your reference standard, which means, are you labeling correctly? Is it a fair labeling right across all of your data? Because if it is not, then you could be introducing a bias, right? Because a portion of your data, let's say, would be answered slightly different than the other one when compared to the gold standard and that's a problem. Okay, the next one is data handling. So data handling is a tricky one, meaning how are you working with your data, pre-processing your data, right? And so that can be challenging for you in many ways. So I'm not going to go through all of these, like we'd be here all morning if I went through every single one of them, but I just wanted to bring to your attention the obvious ones. So information leakage is probably one of the biggest problems in this world of artificial intelligence, machine learning, And essentially what it means, and this is something that's very particular in medicine, is where when you have a training set and you have a test set, one of the problems is machine learning algorithms are inherently lazy. What they want to do, ideally, is memorize the data, right? That's what they would love to do, and that's called overfitting, right? So meaning that the algorithm is so good, the accuracy is so amazing, it's because it memorized the data set. But the problem with that, of course, is if it memorizes every image that's in your training set, it works extremely well for the training set. But when you test it, it doesn't do well at all. And so that's overfitting. You guys know about that. So what's information leakage? So information leakage is where you have data that comes from patients, from participants, and it is shared, if you wish. There's shared images between the training set and the test set. And that's a problem because inevitably you're going to think that your accuracy is strong, but it actually is not, right? And that's because the algorithm was exposed to images that are shared essentially between your training set and your test set. So that's information leakage. So in medicine, essentially what it means is if a patient has, a CT scan, and a CT scan has many slices, some of those, if you randomly sort all of them and split them at the beginning, some of those slices will end up in the test set and some of those slices will end up in the training set. And inevitably, then you've trained on slices for that given patient, which are very highly correlated with the ones in the test set. And so you're going to have what's called information leakage or data leakage. So that's just an example of data handling bias that is a huge problem. Feature scaling is how you scale your features, reliability of your features. So what features are you using? What features are being produced is something that you have to keep in mind in terms of how you do things, because if you don't scale correctly, you could have a problem with a biased algorithm. High dimensionality, that's something that you deal with all the time, and that is, how do you reduce your dimensions? It can introduce systematic bias. The way you reduce the way you reduce certain features is a problem. Perturbations and feature selection, it's all to do with how you manage your features. You have to make sure that the way you manage them is not in a way systematic. Because if you do, you can introduce bias into your data, into your model. Okay. So this is kind of where the fun is, right? And that's the modeling part. And this is where you can also introduce bias into your work. And one of the classic ones, and I don't even have to go over it in detail, I'm certain, is class imbalance. So you have to be very careful about that one when you're training, to make sure that you're not training with an imbalance in what your model is exposed to, because inevitably your model is going to be better at identifying the larger class than the smaller class. And that is a very common problem. And so, we're going to go over some examples of that one in a little bit, but that's a huge one. The bias variance trade-off is something we could lecture about for a whole hour, but that's easy, in the sense as well that you need to find that sweet spot, right, in your model performance, where it's not too biased, which would be too simplistic a model. So a model that is too simplistic will be biased, right? And that is something that you have to be careful about. And on the other end of the spectrum is a high variance model, which essentially is too tuned into your training set, right? And it's too much. It's not generalizable, right? In that sense. And so you have to find that, in between, which is your bias variance trade-off. So you have to be careful on that when you actually decide on a model in the end. And that would impact, that's going to impact the model you choose. The rest of it, hyperparameter tuning, you guys know all about that. But the performance metrics, the generalizability is kind of, how do you express that the model is a good model? That's, a challenge for sure, but can also introduce bias. Generalizability represents, of course, the whole problem with bias, that if you have bias, it's not generalizable to the full population. And then your comparison to how you're comparing your model to what the standard is today can also introduce bias. And then the last one is clinical utility. So clinical utility, once again, which is very important, is how useful is your model? Because if your model is only useful for a portion of what the problem is you're trying to solve, then that, in a sense, is a bias. Okay, so these are things that you very often are not thought of, but that need to be taken into account to make sure that you're not wasting your time. I think that's the biggest piece, is that you're going to spend all this time and effort, and what's going to happen is you're going to end up wasting your time, because the algorithm you've developed is not going to be, either it's not going to be useful or it's not going to be fair, right? Or it's going to be essentially biased. So you have to be very careful of that. The last one is reporting. And this one, once again, you can still introduce bias, and you're going to think, oh, what are you talking about? My model is perfect. Like, it works fantastic. But interestingly, the way you report your findings, the way you report, your model reports, you could actually introduce bias at that stage by the way you report things, the way you share the information. You could actually be introducing bias, which is ironic, right? Because you think my algorithm is not biased, but it could be that the way you're reporting your information is biased. So that's something to take into consideration as well, and often people don't think of that. Okay, so that sums up for us essentially the pipeline of developing models for artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all the possible ways, not all actually, some of the possible ways you can introduce bias into your work. Okay, so that's just a way of remembering, right? This figure kind of gives you a nice summary. Okay, so this is one of the other probably most important things to consider, is your split. And I'm not going to go into detail here as well, because you guys, I'm sure, know how to split data. But I wanted to just bring this to your attention so that when you're reading your friend's, paper, who did a wonderful project on artificial intelligence, machine learning, some of the things you should be looking for are the ones that we've already talked about, which is, is there data leakage, right? That's a big one, right? Everyone looks for, oh my God, is the possibility of data leakage, because that's so huge. Is there class imbalance? Oh my God, there's class imbalance. Those are like really key, right? But the other one that's really key is how you split your data. You really do need to be careful on how you actually split your data so that you can report how generalizable or how good your model is at when it's applied to another, test set, if you wish, right? So, the top here represents the classic split, right? Where you take your data set, you split it into train and test. You never look at the test. You train, and then you test it, and you report the findings, you report the metrics on your test set. Easy, right? Everyone does that. The other one that is very, very, very common is your cross-fold validation, and that's the one on the left. And that one's easy too, right? Like this one has a fourfold, and you split your data set, and then you rotate the segments, right? Easy. The ones that are a little less known is going to be what's called your random sampling cross-validation, essentially, and your nested cross-validation. So those two are a little less common, and they're more specific. So those are applied in more specific, situations when you wish to have a more robust testing, if you wish, testing. I've got to say, from what we do generally is A and B. So we do the split, and then we do B. So we'll report both. So we do the initial split, and then we do the training we do cross validation, and we report the mean of the folds for cross validation, and we report the performance on the test set, the initial split test set, right, from the very beginning, and that's what we report. The other two are, as I said, are for special cases. But this is very important. This is something that whenever you read anybody's work, this is what you're going to want to be looking for to make sure that what they're reporting, so there's your reporting bias, is not problematic. Okay? All right. Now that we've kind of got through the major concerns for bias in your model, the way your pipeline, the next topic that I'd like to talk to you about is what is interpretability versus explainability. So first and foremost, has everyone heard of these terms? I'm sure you've heard of explainability, but have you heard of the difference between interpretability and explainability? Is that, yeah? Yes or no? Yes? Have you guys heard of this? Okay, you're a very quiet group today. But essentially, the difference between interpretability and explainability is actually fairly straightforward, but people don't think of it, right? So interpretability is to understand how a model operates. How does it come to its conclusion? How does it provide you with an answer? Explainability is the same thing, but it lets you into the inner workings of your model. So it provides you with more accessible explanations on how the algorithm is working. So for instance, it would give you an idea of the importance of features, of certain features. Whereas interpretability just explains how the algorithm is kind of working and coming to the conclusion. But explainability provides more in-depth knowledge of the model itself and the features that are being used. Okay, those two are very important because in the world of medicine, it's actually going through the courts now. So the law, we're putting into place law in Canada that includes or basically requires that AI being used in medicine here needs to be interpretable and explainable. So these are important concepts. And let me just go into a little bit more detail. So global and local explainability, what's that? So very simply, global explanation means that overall how your model is making a prediction. So like how does it do what it's doing? So that's what we've just said for explainability, but it's for overall, the model overall, how does it work? The local explanation is more specific. It means for this prediction, this inference, how is it doing that? So meaning if you're going to apply this in practice, and for instance, you're predicting breast cancer from a mammography, the local explanation is going to be, why did this person in particular receive a prediction of yes at risk for breast cancer? This person in particular. Whereas global explanation is going to say overall, the model is operating this way, or what's important for that model. Okay. All right. So there are many approaches that are being used today in order to provide interpretability and explainability. The ones I'm going to talk about today are just really the most, in my opinion, the most commonly used and the most, the ones that you can think of, offhand. Okay. So feature importance, it's no surprise that that's what you want to report on, you want to provide, is what are the features and how important are they? It's not surprising because that is the most important component of the model, right? And so these approaches, impurity-based, permutation, leave one out, feature out. So these are just very classic statistical approaches to see, how is the model affected if, for instance, you permute, a subset of the features, or what if you leave one out, right? So you take a feature out, or you take a few features out, and you say, how is the model working now? And so what it does is it shows it's a way of learning or expressing the importance of some of the features, right? Impurity based, it's just a statistical term that is looking at entropy, right? So entropy means basically heterogeneity, right? Chaos, right? Entropy. And what it does is it permits you to look at, how your features are in terms of reducing or increasing heterogeneity, right? And that's impurity based. Okay, so that's just feature importance. So just remember that you're looking for ways to describe and to provide an explanation through your features. The other approaches that are very well known, and you probably, if you've done any of this, these are probably the two most common approaches, is Shapley, right? So the Shapley additive explanations. And so this one is this is for generally, you can use it for both, but mostly used for global explanation, explanatory or explainability, global explainability. And these are, a fairly common, this is a fairly common approach in explainability, and it's towards prediction, of course. And then you have LIME, which is the local interpretable model agnostic explanations. And so this one is used exclusively, I think, in this one for local explainability, okay? And so these are the two that are generally most accepted these days, other than the general feature explanations, which we just saw in the previous slide, which tend to be also for global explainability. Okay, as I said, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I'm just bringing this to your attention that this is what you should be considering if you want to express or when you want to provide confidence with your algorithm. This is what you would use. Okay, so I'm just touching back on, you guys have all seen this, I'm sure, and this is the bias variance trade-off. And I just touched about it before, and if you remember, I talked about your biased algorithm versus your high variance algorithm, and you're looking for this model that exists in the optimal zone, right? So what's optimal? And the reason you're doing this is to get a model that's with the least amount of bias. And so this is just a nice way to summarize it. And I'm sure you've seen this figure before, that you're looking for the top left, right? You're looking for over here your low bias and high variance, right? Low bias and low variance over here, right? Is what you're looking for. That's the ideal model. And so that's the concept of the bias variance trade-off. And you'll see here, for instance, very often there are students that are learning the bias variance trade-off will always think, well, why is the total error here never at the bottom? Why is it never sitting on the x-axis, right? And that's because you have a certain component of error that is not removable. There's error that will always exist that you cannot remove, and that's the reason that this line here never intersects with the x of error. It can go up and down. You can have more or less total error, or error that cannot be removed. But there's always some error that it's you have to deal with, right? So that's the reason. Okay, so let's jump into some examples of biased models in healthcare. Okay, so as I mentioned first and foremost earlier, that there's a problem with, who does the work and where does the data come from? So here's an example, and the paper is down at the bottom here for you guys to have a look at. And that is, where does all the data come from, right? So first and foremost, authors are predominantly male and non-clinical backgrounds, which is something to take into consideration. And where does most of the data come from today? I mean, it's changing. It's from the United States and from China. That's where the largest data sets, public data sets, are coming from. And so that inevitably introduces a bias. So here's an example where the problem is, what was observed is that, the black population in the United States was substantially less healthy than the white population in the United States, and at any level of prediction. So that seems odd. And what it was is that the algorithm turned out to predict healthcare costs rather than illness. So why did this happen? Because there is unequal access to care in terms of, less dollars spent in what's called lower socioeconomic status, which I talked about earlier. And this is often associated with minority groups. So in the United States, unfortunately, there is not equitable socioeconomic status, and the black population tends to be in a lower socioeconomic status. And so that's the reason that this algorithm was clearly biased, right? So what's the solution? Well, the solution is to make sure that when you're training your algorithm, that you also incorporate race, socioeconomic status, and what's called healthcare consumption. Healthcare consumption means the use of the healthcare system. And if they had done that, which they did in the end, they would have adjusted for this imbalance, right? So that's what it ends up being. It ends up being a class imbalance, an imbalance between the races in terms of the money spent, the healthcare consumed, and their socioeconomic status. Okay. Here's another one. Sex imbalance in medical imaging data sets. And they produce biased convolutional neural network classifiers with less performance in the underrepresented group. So once again, you're going to be thinking, oh, wow, that sounds like class imbalance. Well, you're right. It is a class imbalance. So when you train with an imbalanced data set, unfortunately, the performance is poor in the minority group, right? So in this case, for instance, it was, it doesn't really matter, but it's the same idea. If you're training with male patients and you're testing with female patients, well, you're going to say, well, duh, it's not going to work as well. Yeah, sure. But the thing is sometimes you don't know that when you're training with the data, because you're using images that very possibly, when you receive the images, they were anonymized because of privacy, and you don't know if those images belong to males or females. But then you say, doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. And so here's an example. This is X-rays for knee osteoarthritis. So osteoarthritis, unfortunately, you are all susceptible to knee osteoarthritis. As you get older, it will happen. And when you get scanned for it, you're looking for whether or not you have arthritis in the knee. But here's an example of where X-rays were used in order to see whether or not sex was something the algorithm could identify. Okay, so in this case, the knee region, of course, which is where the osteoarthritis is. As I said, if you train on male and test on female, is there a difference? Yes. So if you look on this graph, if you look at the male model tested in males, it looks fantastic. If you look at the male model tested in females, oh, it's not fantastic. Look at the area of interest, it's different, right? If you look at a female model tested on males, once again, not good. On females, of course, it looks great. And if you have a balanced model, then it works in both. Okay, so there's an example of where you would think, well, why would there be a difference? Well, the problem is that the model is essentially learning the differences between males and females, and so it can tell the difference. Okay. Here's another example. In this one, what it's trying to do in chest x-rays is it's trying to say, what are the activations between male and female? Are they consistent or not? And is it consistent across, in this case, 4 different architectures, right? So can we predict sex with demonstrating similar activations across DNA architectures? And we're showing that we can. So it's not just one architecture in particular that can do it. All of them can do it. And they are similar in terms of what their ability to identify and make the difference between sex. Okay. And so if you have an imbalance in sex in your training set, inevitably you're introducing a bias in your training. Okay, in your model. Okay, here's a little less, obvious bias that can be introduced into your data. And so that is, what if you have missing data? I mean, I'm sure you have worked on data sets where you have missing data. Is that a problem? It can be. If it is missing at random, then you don't have a problem. But if it's systematically missing, then you do. And this can happen. So this is where they found that withholding information, which ends up in missing data, can introduce bias. And the reason for it is because often non-disclosure, is associated with discrimination. So meaning that people are willing to share their information if they feel that they're being discriminated. And so what happens is your data set ends up being unbalanced and will result in a model that is biased. So there's another example that you have to be careful to make sure that, I wonder where all this why do we have this missing data? What's going on here? You need to think about it before you start your training. Okay, so I'm not going to get you guys to answer or lift your hands. You seem to be a quiet group, but can you think of possible biases in your area of research, in your field of research, that could be affecting the training of your machine learning model? Okay. We're going to move on. This is the last section of my talk, and I think I'm doing good on time. I want to make sure I leave time for questions, and that is, we're going to go over, how can we balance innovation and ethics? Okay, so this is by far, in my opinion, the most important way of keeping you on track to doing a good job in your model development, and that is value alignment. Okay, what it means is that you have to understand that humans, and you're one of them, you use your experience, your memories, your teachings, your education, what is culturally, normal for you in order to make your decisions. And you're asking your algorithm to do the same, right? You're asking your algorithm to make that decision, to make that prediction, along with what you believe in. So you have to make sure that the algorithm you use is aligned with your values, or more importantly, the values of who, I just moved through, I didn't mean to do that, of who you are applying or generalizing the algorithm to, okay? So you need to make sure that that's, taken into account. Another way of looking, into safeguarding or producing machine learning algorithms that are as balanced as possible. There are ways, not balanced, sorry, basically as unbiased as possible. There are newer ways now that are coming out that are pretty exciting that may allow us to do this. And that's, for instance, blockchain. I'm sure you've heard a lot about blockchain. And the other one is called federated learning. You may have learned that as well. But federated learning, both of them, blockchain and federated learning, that's still in their early days for medical research anyway. Maybe financial, it's not. But federated learning is a big deal, right? So being able to share the weights of your models through across different centers to improve the model is very expensive. It's very challenging. And it only works if you really have the will and the money and the, the infrastructure. And so we're getting there, but it's, we're not there yet. But just to say there are emerging technologies that can help. Okay. How about unconscious biases, right? Or what's called shortcut biases, right? So these, once again, I'm going back to biases. I'm just trying to bring to your attention ways that, your data could be biased and therefore your model will be biased, right? So availability bias, these are, overestimating events because they're more available is classic. And that's the one that you need to definitely keep in mind is how is your data collected? Always ask, how is your data collected? And then you will be able to see possibly that there is this availability bias, right? So availability bias would be as well as what's called survivor bias in medicine. Survivor bias means that if you're still alive, you're going to be contributing data. But if you've died, you're not contributing data anymore. So really, your algorithm will always be biased because it's biased to people who are alive. Survivor bias. That's called survivor bias. So in many cases, it doesn't matter because you're only interested in the people who are alive. But in other cases, it's actually quite important that you understand the difference between people that are very sick or dead, and those people that are still alive. So there's that's an example of availability bias, right? What's called base rate fallacy is when you tend to ignore general information and you only focus on something very specific. So be careful on that one because then the generalizability. Sorry, my slides are jumping through. You have to be careful on having a model that's too specific. Okay, congruence bias is the tendency to test something through direct testing, right? Instead of looking at what's your alternate hypothesis can be. And that's a little bit more statsy, but you do need to be careful on that one as well. Don't just zero in on the one thing. Always check your alternate hypotheses, right? Here's these last two are well, not last two, but these two are tricky. So empathy, gap bias, right? Which is, what's the feeling, you tend to underestimate the influence, of a feeling of what you have for yourself or for somebody else. And you definitely need to be careful of that. Okay. Stereotyping, I'm sure, as you know, that's classic. When you're stereotyping a subpopulation or something like that, that's definitely something that you need to be careful about. Okay, impartial. I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker because you're starting. I hope you're starting to get a feel for what I'm trying to get at, which is, making sure that the data you pick up on is fair, right, and is balanced, right? So anchoring bias, bandwagon bias, blind spot. These are all ways of the way you see data, the way the data is collected. Okay. Confirmation bias and halo effect. These are big in medicine. But for instance, if you have a tendency to only look for or interpret something that confirms what you want, right? So that's really important, right? So that you're looking for ways to confirm what you're interested in. That's very common, right? The halo effect is the overall impression that would, basically, the positive feelings in one area, right, will cause, neutral traits or things that are a little ambiguous to be positive. So I mean the halo effect means you're just being overly positive, and because you want that, you want it to be true, and that's your bias, right? Self-interest, of course, there's no surprise there, and that is, what you're interested in, you're going to bias towards. Okay, and so that's, there's many of these self-interest bias, and as you can see, it all depends on what you're interested in, what you want to change, what you want to focus on. That's your self-interest, and that's, something that's the reason. For instance, I have disclosures for conflict of interest, because I have a self-interest in my own company. It makes sense, right? So there's an example. And then, so these are just more self-interest biases, but I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to zip through them, because there's just so many of them. But I just want to make sure that you're aware, right, that there's so many of these biases that you need to consider when you're collecting data, right? Okay, so how do we fix it? Well, it's no big surprise, right? You must investigate and understand, where's your bias? Where did it come from? And how can it be changed, right? You can then go back and look at your design, and try and develop your algorithm without these biases. And that's the best way you can be successful, right? Is you do your best, right? The last piece is key, right? So create a feedback mechanism. So it means that it's not ended when you finish your model. Once you've implemented your model, you're going to want to try and readdress this, often, right? To make sure that your model is successful and continues to be successful. Okay. How do you do that as an institution? This is just to remember it, to make it easy to remember. You inventory, you screen, you retrain, and you prevent. Okay. That's what you need to do as an institution, is that you have to make a list of the algorithms you're using. You need to screen them regularly for bias, and you need to retrain your algorithm if you find bias, or you should just retrain them generally, because as what happens over time is you can have what's called a distribution or a drift, right? A distribution drift shift in your data. And so you need to retrain regularly to do that. And then the last thing is set up your structure to prevent future biases, which is usually done through a committee. Okay. So, as students, you're probably only very focused on, working on how do I develop the model? How do I just work with the data? That's the only thing that I'm interested in. But inevitably, when you get hired, when you have a job, this is going to become important for you, right? That you're going to have to contribute to the success of your algorithm. And if you do not make the effort, what's going to happen is that your algorithms will not be useful. They're not going to be something that makes an impact in what you were supposed to develop the algorithm for, which is such a shame, because you work so hard at it. But then in the end, your algorithm's not going to be used, or it can't be trusted, or it's not used with confidence, which would be a shame. And that's because of potential biases in your algorithms. And that is it. I left a few minutes here for questions. If you'd like to ask me any questions or comments, or share a little of your experience of what
Hello,
you
sir.
guys are doing, I'd love to hear.
Hello, sir. Thank you for giving this wonderful lecture. Sir, in the case of generative advisor network, I want to use the GAN, okay, to generate a new images. What is the impact
Mhm.
of this bias in that trained model, GAN?
That's a great question. So I think your question is there the possibility of perpetuating a bias in generative AI? I think that's what I've understood using GAN. And yes, it is absolutely possible. And that, how essentially it works the same way. If the way you're developing your algorithm, your GAN, for instance, or if you're using diffusion models, that's the hot topic these days, right? Um, when you're creating that model, the way you train that model, the data you're using to train that model, what it's going to do if it's imbalanced, for instance, or if you're using only white male data, let's say, what's going to happen is the algorithm is going to learn very well to generate those types of images, and it will actually apply it to the subgroups, because that's all it knows how to do. So that's the tricky bit, is you're going to have this wonderful algorithm that works fantastic for white males, and then when you apply it to other subpopulations, you're going to end up with it not really looking quite right. It's going to be like, well, it's funny. Everybody kind of looks like a white male, and that's what the problem is going to be. So it is still the problem will persist in generative AI. So, but that's an excellent question. What I don't know, and I think it's dependent on your data and your algorithm, is how much of a problem it's going to be. How robust can your algorithm be if you do train with an imbalance? That's a great it's a great question. It's a good one. It's a good one. But yes, it is possible as well. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sir, is there any way to know that impactness of that bias when I train a model, any model, if any way for check the impactness of that bias in that model?
Is there a way to check?
Yes,
is that your question?
Yes, sir.
You're okay. You're asking, how do I know? You're asking, how do I know? Is that right?
Sir?
Excellent question. That's excellent. And actually, it's more simple than you think. So let me give you an example. I am implementing some of our algorithms that we developed into clinical practice, right? And I'm implementing them in Costa Rica. So the algorithm that we trained, we do traumatic brain injury. Okay, so when you hit your head and you bleed in your head, so brain hemorrhage or cerebral hemorrhage, that's a problem. And I'm sure it's a problem in India too. And that is called a traumatic brain injury. So we've developed a few algorithms to detect a hemorrhage in the brain from a brain CT, a head CT. Another one to prognosticate, so to tell how you're going to be in 6 months. And those two algorithms assist the clinical staff, right? So we trained on what's called center TBI. So center TBI is a very big network in Europe for a traumatic brain injury. And so we got a couple of thousand CT scans from Europe, and we trained on it. We're successful. Yay, great. Everything's wonderful. But we're going to deploy in Costa Rica. So there's an example of, how are we going to know if our algorithm is biased? So what we did do is we tested, so we did what's called an external validation of our algorithm using Sinter TBI. And Sinter TBI is from India. So Sinter TBI is an affiliated group where they collected head CTs for traumatic brain injury in India. And so we tested our algorithm specifically on Sinter TBI data, and it was very close. So the loss in performance, it was minimal, really not significantly, not statistically significant. And so that was the way we tested. And that would be how you can look for bias, because in that case, I know I tested on European data. I trained on European data. I tested on data from India, right? And so that would be looking for an ethnic bias, right? So is there going to be a problem due to ethnicity, right? And then when I deploy in Costa Rica, the first thing we have to do is test. So the first thing we're doing in Costa Rica is we're going to get a set of head CTs in India, and not in India. Sorry, it's still early in the morning for me. A set of head CTs from Costa Rica, and then we're going to test it, and we're going to see. And so that's the only way, really, of discovering bias is by testing, right? Either that, or you need to think about it. You need to suspect there's bias based on the data that you've collected. If you learn about your data as much as possible, you would be able to theoretically detect bias by determining that there's an imbalance in the data set that you trained on. Okay, so those are the two ways. You can validate using an external validation set, completely external, not a split, completely external, or you can do it theoretically.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Any other
Maybe I'll
questions?
stop my share.
If not, we'll conclude.
Okay.
Okay. On behalf of Department of Computer Science, I sincerely thank Professor Pascal Tyrrell for an informative and very useful session on minimizing bias on medical AI. Your expertise and your insights greatly enhanced our knowledge, sir. It has greatly enhanced our knowledge in ethical principles, challenges in personal data ethics, clinical research, data ethics in AI and ML, types of biases in data, machine learning pipeline, interpretability and explainability, along with few approaches like SHAP and LIME. Sir also addressed few important aspects of racial and gender biases in medical AI, balancing innovation and ethics, then few emerging technologies like blockchaining and federal learning, and also steps to resolve biases, etc. So thank you, sir, for your time and knowledge. We really felt fortunate to have an opportunity to learn from you. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was my pleasure. Hopefully, I'll be able to come one day to India and lecture. I've never been to India, so that'd be wonderful. But thank you. I appreciate it.
So it's an honor and pleasure for us to have you online, and it is a wonderful opportunity to all the participants present over here. And we greatly feel proud that you kindly accepted our invitation to be a part of this faculty development program. We are looking forward to meet you maybe in the GAN program. So we welcome to.
That'd be great.
Yeah, see you in India soon. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I hope you all had a great week, because I know I'm coming at the end here, so you're all probably like, yeah. You're all done your week, so that's good. But that's great. Anyway, have a great rest of your conference if you have much more, or your workshop anyway. So